Discussant. So, hello and a very warm welcome to the participants and speakers to the last session of the Rethinking Economics India Network annual event, Dialogues on Economic Reality. Thank you very much for joining us on a Sunday evening. The Rethinking Economics India, started amidst the pandemic, has sought to create a space wherein multiple stakeholders like individuals, universities, the private and public sector, and the society can participate in a scalable and collaborative effort to learn, teach, and discuss pathways for building a better economy for the society. Our annual event, Dialogues on Economic Realities, marks the culmination of delivering numerous focused deliberations and projects within the domain of heterodox and pluralist economics in India, bringing together a consortium of voices from local and international think tanks, youth-led organizations, academicians, and activists to ponder and brainstorm on ideas and solutions for reshaping our understanding and implementation of economic policies and theories. The theme for today is curriculum reform in economics, and until now, we've had a session on challenges for promoting pluralistic curriculum reforms and decolonizing economics curriculum workshop. This fireside chat aims to outline the history of evolution of economics curriculum in India and understand the politics around economics education and the pedagogical practices around different institutions in India. It will draw on the different frameworks and interlinkages of economics education from the historical perspective to the present times. With us to discuss some of these tenets are Dr. Sanjay Reddy and Dr. Rahul. Sanjay Reddy is an associate professor of economics at the New School for Social Research. He's also an affiliated faculty of the Politics Department of the New School for Social Research. His areas of work include development economics, international economics, and economics and philosophy. In conversation with Dr. Reddy will be Dr. Rahul, who is an assistant professor of economics at School of Arts and Sciences at Azim Premji University. His research interests include history of capitalism in India, informal labor process, political economy of the mass media, teaching economics. He is currently working on a manuscript titled Economic Policy in India, a History of Prices, Contestation and Consensus, which charts a history of economic policy in India, from colonial to contemporary times for a non-specialized reader. So now, without taking any more of the time, I would like to hand over the session to Rahul to take this conversation forward. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks, Samriti, and thanks to Rethinking Economics India Group. I just wanted to say this is a very nice endeavor. I think as a student, I would love to be part. I would love to have heard something like this. Also, I welcome Sanjay. Great to have you on board with this chat. And before starting, I should just quickly say this is particularly exciting for me because I had a privilege of hearing Sanjay, I think almost 10 years ago, when I was a doctoral student. And as an economics student, you sort of always juggling what you think is the most important things in economics, which is micro, macro, theory, quant. And I think Sanjay's talk was about the philosophical foundations. And one of the first people to make me think that economics is much more broader than what's taught in college. So lovely to have you aboard, Sanjay. I think maybe let me just set up maybe the first idea we can work with. So today we'll talk a bit about how economics as a discipline developed in India, especially what kind of institutions and how it was influenced by other departments in the West, and then sort of talk a little bit about where economics curriculum is now, and what are the way forwards or what are the ways it can evolve. Sanjay, so I thought maybe I'll just start with just this idea, that economics was originally developed mostly in Western English-speaking nations. I actually try to do a bit of research and found there's not a lot directly talking about, what were the earliest departments in India, who were the first people who brought it in? Did we have British teachers or the first set of Indians who went abroad? I wanted to know from you if you knew anything about what was the state of economics in colonial India, even like just around the time of independence.
Yeah, great question, Rahul. But let me just say, first of all, I'm going to be, of course, speaking about this issue and others, but that doesn't mean I'm qualified to do so. And I told the organizers at the very outset that, as somebody who has lectured as a guest in Indian universities and feels that I have some exposure to Indian universities curricula and their characteristics and have some limited understanding of the syllabi. Nevertheless, I'm very aware that I have not taught as a staff member in any Indian university for any length of time, unlike Rahul, and unlike many of the other people who participated in these sessions. So I'm not actually the best qualified person from that point of view, who's been inside the whale, so to speak, who could therefore give more of an interior perspective on the issue. So if you'll forgive me for that, I will nevertheless venture forward and make some remarks, but with the qualification that others will know better some of the facts about how curricula are evolving and what are some of the specific characteristics of the syllabi in different places and so on, which I have only a scant idea about. I see, by the way, that we have one very distinguished attendee, which is Jomo, and of course the other attendees are very distinguished also. But I would like to say that insofar as a number of the issues that we discuss also have global roots and ramifications, and Jomo is very well aware of the Indian situation too. It would be wonderful to involve him in this conversation if he so wishes at any point as a press ganged panelist. Okay. So in response to your question, Rahul, I think that the history of Indian economics probably has yet to be told, and certainly has yet to be told. I think that there are some gleanings one can gather here and there. For instance, recently, there's been some interesting work done on the Bombay School of Economics and Sociology. And it's interesting that it viewed itself very much as a school of economics and sociology, not just a school of economics, in the early to mid 20th century and later. It had origins in the early 20th century, but it really flourished in the mid 20th century, which had a considerable impact on the thinking of nationalists about post-independence India, but also in the understanding of what economics as a subject is and what form it should take to be appropriate to India. And that, I think, consciousness has been largely lost. So it has to be recovered that there was such a school and that it had particular origins, that it flourished in a particular period of time, that it made contributions of a particular kind. And similarly, of course, we know that the history of economics in Bengal is very storied, and there's a micro history as well as a macro history, so to speak, to be told about that. The micro history concerning the specific individuals and personalities, and who taught whom, and how they arrived in particular institutions such as Presidency College, and what kind of curriculum was set up and what kind of influence that had. But the macro history having to do with the way in which the East India Company, in particular, and later the British colonial government in India, established a certain pattern of study of economics and a certain understanding of it. Just the other day, in the group on currency and empire, which we have at the New School, which I was mentioning earlier in discussion with some of the panelists and organizers, we had a very interesting conversation about the way in which the British East India Company really had economics, economic discourse, economic thought at its center in certain respects. The conversation was with Manu Goswami, the historian at New York University, who has been working on this topic. Now, of course, ever since Ranajit Guha wrote his book on elementary aspects, and of course, prior to that, I meant to say, on the permanent settlement, a rule of property for Bengal, we have known that ideas of what would generate the right incentives for farmers or for landlords, what would maximize output so that in turn revenue could be maximized by the East India Company, were very central. And there was a debate about economic ideas and economic principles that took place under the aegis of the East India Company and very much driven by its own motivations to maximize those revenues. But what I think still has to be really told more fully is the story of how the colonial world generally became a kind of a testing ground for economic ideas. And one can look, of course, beyond India to see other examples of this, although India was very, very central, as Ranajit Guha emphasized, as a zone for trying out some of these ideas. Hong Kong, for example, was a place where a lot of the liberal economic ideas or particular understandings of what would be the right policies to unleash a commercial activity that would be in turn beneficial to the British Crown, the East India Company, and then the Crown were thought about and implemented to some degree. Now, there's also the other side, which is that British economics was profoundly shaped by the colonial encounter in ways that have not been really recognized. So when we say that economics as we know it had its origins in Europe, I think that's a little bit, that's partially true, but it's also a simplification in the sense that we can see the effects of the colonial encounter on the shaping of economics from the very beginning. You know, Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations is centrally concerned with the question of colonial economic policy. What would be the appropriate economic relationship between the mother country and the colonies? What are the appropriate trade or commercial policies and so forth from the point of view of both? Because he has a liberal sensibility, he tends to imagine that they can flourish together. But certainly colonial economic policy is central to his understanding. In particular, I would say he imagines that Britain and America could flourish together. He's not so sure about Britain and India, as Burke, of course, was not. And maybe they saw more elements of a trade-off there, which is interesting, a recognition of that. But moving forward to the 19th century, of course, you have the fact that Neville Keynes, John Stuart Mill, and of course Bentham, previous to Mill, John Maynard Keynes, they all had deep connections to colonial administration. Yeah. So over a century, you have the problems of colonial administration really shaping the thinking of these figures, even though it's not explicitly acknowledged. So one has to go a little bit deeper than the official narratives in order to understand that. I think only now, and this is coming out in Manu Goswami's work, as it has come out in some other people's work, such as Utsav Patnaik's, only now are we beginning to understand that the extent to which the problem of colonial administration was central for the shaping of John Maynard Keynes, for instance. And this is glossed over entirely by Robert Skidelsky and other well-known biographers of Keynes. So I think this whole story, both about what happened in India and in other parts of the colonial world to seed a new subject of economics in the universities and so on, as well as what influence it had, what career it had in those societies, on the one hand, and on the other hand, how that encounter shaped constitutively from the very beginning what we think of as metropolitan economics. I think this project of historiography has still to be really conducted, let alone completed.
Thanks, Sanjay. So yeah, that's, I think, a very interesting point to start, because the colonial encounter itself is shaped in some sense from the discipline of economics. And, as Sanjay mentioned, some of the most well-known names were probably, through the colonial office, sort of the colonies were kind of the experiment for a lot of the policies, a lot of thinking around policies. So maybe I'll just add, I mean, I didn't know much about institutional economics, and I went out looking for a bit, and really I just found one work which sort of addresses it, which is a work by Terry Bynes called Major Parliamentary Debates. And he provides a very pedantic history, but for me, I think it set up two interesting questions. And, if it's all right, maybe I'll just bring them up and, maybe it will help us look at the next part of the discussion. So I think, I don't know a lot about 19th century, but, in the 20th century, one thing that strikes out is, in the mid 20th century, you already have your first criticism of colonial policies, economic criticisms, and, by the 1930s, especially after the experience of depression, there's already thinking in India about what would be their policies, what would be India's first policies. There's a lot of talk about how the experiences of how Britain developed, how US developed cannot be the same in India. There's also influences from Russia who's developing. And very early on, planning becomes, an important policy instrument for India going forward. And, that's where the role of economists is. And, a couple of interesting things comes out. So, one thing is there's this very interesting quote by Meghnad Desai, and he says, if you look at the history of economic departments in India, there was first the Bombay-Delhi axis, and then what he calls later the Delhi-Calcutta axis. And he looks at how there were two sort of important institutions in Maharashtra, which was sort of identified as the first start of economic departments. There was, as Sanjay mentioned, the Bombay School of Economics, started by C.N. Vakil, who even I know very little, but was kind of influential in the first two drafts. And, he kind of wanted to make Bombay School based on London School. And, as, Sanjay mentioned, it was just not economics, it was economics and sociology. And, they produced some of the influential early economists in India. Most well-known of them was V.K.R.V. Rao and Krishna Bhardwaj. Parallelly, D.R. Gadgil opens the Gokhale Institute of Politics. This is all just before independence. And, Gadgil is Gadgil is a critique of planning, and well known for coming into the Planning Commission in the 60s and sort of changing how the Planning Commission worked. I think the other two institutions, I'll come to my prompt soon. The two big institutions after independence was P.C. Mahalanobis starts ISI, and that becomes kind of the nerve center of where sort of the major statistical, all the statistics at the forefront of the discipline is discussed, and they play an important role in the first two plans. One interesting story about ISI is, the kind of important economists who passed through in those years, people like Oscar Lang, Ragnar Frisch, Nicholas Calder, Galbraith, Paul Baran. And on the other side in Delhi, V.K.R.V. Rao starts Delhi School of Economics, which is also based on the idea of London School of Economics. And slightly later, but Delhi School of Economics in the 50s really takes off and has a range of, what you consider the golden generation of teachers. In the early 60s, you have people like K.N. Raj, Amartya Sen, Sukumai Chakrabarti, Jagdish Bhagwati, Manmohan Singh. So maybe I think the first thing of great interest to me was that the early economists, well-known economists, and the people who opened the early institutions seem to be very involved with either directly in the policy making in Nehruvian times, or important criticizers of people who commented on economics. I was curious to know, Sanjay, if you had any thoughts about how some of the early economists shaped economic policy in India, or maybe another way of thinking about is how these maybe, I know these institutions are not very well known, but can we think of something as the grassroots of what would be an Indian economics department or Indian economic thought coming over, with thinking about planning, thinking around some of the early problems that India was facing?
Well, Rahul, I hope you'll answer your own questions also, because they're very good questions. You should answer them too. And again, would be very glad to have Jomo and others who have insights on these issues contribute. But let me say, I think one way to think about the answer to your question is that, especially in the colonial context, but generally, of course, there is a dialectical aspect to how economic discourse functions. So to the extent that, for instance, the imperial economic discourse was by and large one of, to borrow a phrase from the Japanese, co-prosperity, that could be achieved by the imperial and the colonial, well, by the colonizer and the colonized. The nationalist economists, so to speak, some of whom were formally accredited, but by and large, most of whom were not, who found their way into economic debates despite a lack of formal economic training. They presented an alternative picture involving, for instance, the idea of the colonial drain, which in retrospect is well justified, even though it was obscured by the economic argumentation of the colonizer. And so it required the development of a counter discourse in order to draw attention to that. And to this day, there are new possibilities which are emerging. For example, Utsa Patnaik's recent efforts at a forensic accounting of the extent of colonial drain, and that of other people who have preceded her in recent or modern times, building upon that basic insight of nationalist economists. And similarly, with respect to the question of laissez-faire versus planning, for instance. Although, of course, that's a little bit more complicated because the question of planning was gaining attention, and the possibilities for planning and the recommendation of planning was gaining prestige, even in the UK and in the Western world and in the metropolitan world, as a result of the Soviet development experience and more generally the aftermath of the Great Depression and also the response, of course, to the challenge posed by socialism, the social democratic compromise in Europe and in the Western world, increasingly, with some exceptions, introduced some element of planning, especially in the immediate post-Second World War period. So I think that's less clearly a question of discourse and counter discourse, but at any rate, I think one can see that you have, dominant discourses, and then you have responses in some sense, which are produced as a result of people's experiences and the need to pierce the veil which has been presented by those dominant discourses. So insofar as we're interested in curriculum here and education, I think one of the interesting things to look at historically would be to what extent the official curricula of places like Bombay University or Calcutta University in the pre-independence era was limited in terms of recognizing any of these criticisms. And let me just say one word about the present. I think one can see echoes of this in the present as well, in the way in which you have, so to speak, official or dominant discourses about, let's say, financial globalization and its merits. And then you have counter discourses.
So, I think one more thing I found interesting, and you mentioned this, and I was also curious to see how this change happened. It seems to me, if you look at curricula earlier, economics was always taught alongside other subjects. So, some of the well-known, like London School of Economics, sociology was an important course, and it seems like it was important for students to know history, to know a history of economic thought, a bit of politics, and somehow over time curriculum, I know more for India, but I wanted to know what my sense is. Maybe it's happened in the West, that it started becoming more and more focused in technical aspects of economics or like a certain theoretical aspects of economics. Is there any sense of how and why this thinning of what is how the discipline of economics of thought, economics has happened? Or is there sort of any noticeable points in time historically which explain how this has happened?
I think, Rahul, the answer to that question really requires us to go back to metropolitan economics and look at some aspects of its internal evolution. It has been pointed out, for instance, that if you pick up an issue of the American Economic Review, to take an example, though it would be true of the Economic Journal or other things, from earlier period, in particular from the in the case of the American Economic Review from the 1920s or 30s or even the 1940s, you'll see that there are quite a number of articles which are really in an institutionalist vein. You might find, for instance, that I'm giving this example because I recall it, an article about the coal mines of West Virginia, which describes their production system, the role of workers, how they are recruited, whether there's any kind of trade union organization, and so on and so forth. A case study about the coal mines of West Virginia, describing the different aspects of economic aspects that pertain to them. And there might be some element of institutionalist economic theory that entered there, but by and large, they were deeply, even profoundly empirical investigations. And there would be no equations and no attempts at broader kind of decontextualized formalization. Those kinds of articles disappeared completely, right? And by the 1950s, they simply don't appear. And even a broader kind of institutional economics, a theorizing that might be able to, one might imagine, hold its own vis-a-vis the emergent mathematical economics, also by and large disappears, or it's not present, not visible. What you have instead, you have the revolution that's ushered in by Samuelson and others, of course, which presents a new ideal as to what economics should be in order to be scientific. And so the mathematization of economics in particular proceeds apace. One sees a really comprehensive adoption of this ideal and the conceit that anything else is nonsense. I was talking yesterday night, it turns out, with somebody who was an Indian who happened to know John Kenneth Galbraith quite well. And we were together recalling that Paul Krugman at one stage was deeply dismissive of John Kenneth Galbraith on the ground that any model is better than no model. Well, we see where that's gotten us in the global financial crisis and other instances. Whereas the wisdom of someone like Galbraith, who didn't have a model or didn't use a model in the formal sense that a Krugman would understand what a model is, was completely derided and rejected. So Galbraith was entirely an outsider in the economics profession, or largely, despite his perch at Harvard, because he had happened to get tenure earlier in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And 90s. He died in the late 90s. So this is something that happened in metropolitan economics. Now, I'll just say one word about its globalization, the globalization of this model. And I'm going to use a country other than India as an example. And again, our friend Jomo will have lots of thoughts, I'm sure, much more insight about this. I'm going to use the example of Mexico. Mexico, like many of the countries in Latin America, had its own economics tradition, as India did. In India, we talk about Indian economics, which is actually a subject in the curriculum, or has been at times, which involves, in some sense, the institutional makeup of the Indian economy and the particular economic thought traditions that have emerged in India too. Well, Mexico also has had, as much of Latin America has had, its own indigenous, so to speak, economic discourse that's more oriented toward its own questions and problems, but also which involves its own insights. Now, this was very well reflected in the public universities. In the case of Mexico, UNAM, a government institution, public university, prestigious institution in Mexico City, was one of the places where you had this more eclectic kind of, but also indigenous in roots, economic tradition. Then there's another institution which came in called ITAM, which is the MIT of Mexico, which became the beachhead, so to speak, as I understand it, from which the new technical and technocratic economics, highly mathematized, neoliberal typically in its policy prescriptions, neoclassical in its methodology, not just emerged, but became dominant, right? So UNAM's prestige decreases, so to speak, in policy, in the hinge between economics and policy, and ITAM's increases. This kind of a phenomenon, which was, of course, very much associated in time with neoliberal economic reforms of the 1980s, happens in many, many countries, right? I think in India, we have not seen quite as stark a contrast, but one still sees these tectonic plates shifting. The gradual development of increasing prestige for one kind of economics, decreasing prestige for another kind of economics. And of course, that's associated also with things like journal rankings, which become a basis for rewarding publications. So it doesn't show up directly in teaching, but it indirectly creates a cultural shift, which brings about curricular change too, because the journals at the top of those rankings are typically American, to some extent European or international, but certainly adopt that neoclassical orientation, and to some extent neoliberal, considerable extent neoliberal too, in many instances. So I would, emphasize the methodological rather than the policy orientation in the first instance.
Yeah, I mean, if I may add something more contemporaneous, I mean, I've had a lot of conversation with college teachers in India, and you were talking about how journals sort of shape the kind of areas that people want to research in, the kind of areas that you build expertise in, as a consequence, areas that get taught in economics department. Most teachers talk about kind of three things which shape curricular decisions for them, and I like to think it's kind of the political economy of economics curriculum, which is one is that, of course, what are the disciplines which get more funding, or what are the disciplines which get more visibility. Connected to that is what are the perceived parts of economics which get you jobs, because that's one of the things that students are all about. And then two other parts, which is one is what they call the politics of the textbook, which is that if you have a textbook which is chosen by the university board, it's very hard to change it, because it's in the publisher's interest to keep continuing that. And certain textbooks have become and certain textbooks shape curriculum more than the curriculum shaping what textbooks is used. And of course, the third part is just the training that teachers come for. And most teachers in India, especially at the college level, don't get to update their knowledge at all after they start teaching, just because of the heavy load of teaching and just the avenues through which you can update yourself. And a lot of them say that as a consequence, you just end up teaching these 4-5 subjects which you've been taught and which are popular and which there are material and textbooks around. One more interesting thing in India, I don't know if there's an equivalent, is what they say how the exams shape what the curriculum is. And some teachers say that if we changed what we taught, then students would struggle, because we know these are the kind of questions you ask. So irrespective of your own interests, you have to teach those parts where the exams come from, and examiners can't change the questions, because they say that a lot of teachers won't be able to teach because that's what they've learned to teach. And it seems like a lot of curriculum is shaped by these kind of questions. Maybe a little, I think our larger mandate was talking about curriculum in India. So maybe I thought I'd pivot a little bit in contemporary India. I think one of the trends that seems to define curriculum in India is till the early 2000s, most of the big departments are public universities, and public universities in India are defined by two kinds of things. One is bureaucracies and just the difficulty of changing anything, and two is just the sheer size of numbers that they have to work with. So there was very little flexibility, and some universities were lucky to be smaller. Not universities, I say some departments like ISI, IGIDR, Gokhale was lucky to be smaller and could change. But if you look at some of the larger ones like Delhi University, Calcutta University, JNU, over time it wasn't possible. Then comes a moment in 2007 where the Indian government allows privatization of universities, and you start having slowly 1, 2, and now if you look at it, you could say there are a good 7, 8 economics departments which are free to make their own curriculum, to think how they want to what kind of books they want to use, what are the new kinds of more updated disciplines, more updated knowledge, and suddenly finally it's kind of opening up the kind of courses, updating your books, updating material. But still, if I look through all the major departments in India, I just come to my question. You tend to find 4 or 5 subjects which are still very important. And I think econometrics is right at the forefront of it. You still have the importance of micro, macro. Development economics is important, but not really an important subject. A lot of focus on programming, on being able to run regressions. I think one of the things I want to know is that even with so much flexibility, I don't know why economics curriculum don't have more of courses you found early on, which is development economics, looking at how power shifts things, how society is shaped. Something like agriculture, which is such an important problem in India, is almost disappeared from the curriculum. The state of industry, questions around, I mean, I think planning is probably pretty irrelevant now, but questions around, how economics policies, and then of course, history. I mean, I know Sanjay, you were saying you didn't know much about India, but I wanted to know from you, how would you think, if we were, let's say, a new department, what are the kind of macro questions that should shape, the curriculum given today's context in India?
Just to be clear, I didn't say I don't know much about India, though that might be true.
Sorry,
nobody knows anything about India.
Yeah. No, I meant to say that not that much about universities in India.
Indeed, or the current curricula and so on. You raised a lot of hugely important questions, Rahul, and so many. One could go on and on in responding to them. But let me just touch on a few thoughts, present a few thoughts, and then maybe you have some more thoughts, and Jomo may have some thoughts. So first of all, the difficulty of changing curricula that you described in practice is, I think, a really interesting problem. In the language of institutional economics, there are institutional complementarities between different parts of the system, which create a kind of a lock-in that makes it hard to change, right? And Robert Boyer and many other people have written about this, how when you have these interlocking aspects of a system, then only a systemic change, which moves the whole thing from one order or one orientation, one equilibrium, so to speak, to another, would suffice. You can't change the curriculum in one university without changing the examination board's makeup or rules, for example, or its attitudes, as you point out. So, or the level of freedom which an individual institution has to set its own curriculum. So these are interlocking problems. And as you point out, there are issues of various kinds that may be specific to India. Scale, for instance. There have been some interesting articles in EPW in recent years about how the state university system, by and large, gets neglected in our discussions of universities in India, but that's where the vast majority of students are being educated. And by and large, they're employing, in some sense, derivative curricula, at least the prescribed curricula. So if one really wanted to change how economics is experienced in India and what effects it has, perhaps one would pay more attention to that and not just to the Delhi School of Economics or institutions that are comparable to it, or Ashoka University for that matter, since you mentioned the new private as well as traditional public institutions. By the way, in the Mexico example I gave earlier, the second institution, ITAM, was private. I should have mentioned that, as opposed to the first one, which was public. Now, these are all reasons, in some sense, to think that the discussion and maybe the struggle has to be on a larger canvas. It can't just be on the institutional level, even though there are connections between these. Or because, I should say, because there are connections between these. You also mentioned some of the narrowness of the official curriculum, the role of econometrics and the emphasis on regression analysis, for instance. That's something that's always struck me as being a very surprising, perhaps, but also not so surprising feature of economics as taught in India and elsewhere in the developing world, where you have so much in front of your eyes, which you can learn from. One does. There are so many ethnographic possibilities, so many institutional observations and so on, which could motivate investigation. And of course, there are some theorists in India who have used that as a basis for their investigations. I think of some of Kaushik Basu's work, for instance, which, it's light on econometrics, if he ever does econometrics, but it starts with institutional observations or some type of observation, then moves into theory and policy. I don't tend to agree with some of his conclusions, but that's a different matter. Just in terms of the style, it doesn't see econometrics as necessarily having to be involved there when you have your own eyes, right? And so if we ask the question, why does econometrics gain the importance that it does, especially in a society where we don't always have the data we might want to have about many things, or the concepts which we employ may be in order to collect the data may be inappropriate. The concept of unemployment in India, for instance, whether it's really appropriate in the way that it's conceived, can be questioned. I think this probably has a lot, again, to do with the hierarchies of knowledge production and dissemination and legitimation globally, that because econometrics has the position of prestige it does in the world, it has that position of prestige in Indian economics. And this is not to deny the world-leading position of Indian econometricians and statisticians in some areas, which clearly they have had historically. Mahalanobis, C.R. Rao, many other figures who were, really at the very forefront of world discussions of some of these issues. But still, I think one does have to look at this gradient, this hierarchy, in some sense as being present. And there's a kind of let me say something which may or may not be seem right to everyone, but I think there's a kind of Brahmanism also which is involved in that, which is an idea that you want to stay in your ivory tower, so to speak, as distant as possible from empirical the soil, from the empirical soil. You don't want to be a tiller of the soil, but you can collect data on the soil and analyze it. Or somebody else, if somebody else collects it, you can analyze it. Though that's not specific to or unique to India. One last thing, you mentioned that that development economics is hardly taught. That's again something I find fascinating, that of course the policymakers no longer talk about India as a developing country. In fact, even the IMF has adopted the language of emerging market and developing country, where the developing countries are the lower income countries. And India is supposedly an emerging market, not a developing country. Now, linguistically, that's fascinating. It's not even a country, it's a market, according to current IMF terminology. Second, I think because it's viewed as somehow unprestigious, as somehow a mark of dishonor, the idea of India as a developing country is no longer talked about really in high-level official discourse. The solidarity that existed between India and other developing countries is to some extent breaking down. Sometimes you'll see it on the vaccine issue, for instance. The India-South Africa proposal for an intellectual property rights waiver was an example of that, still being present. But there are many other issues where India is taking a distant approach, no longer being the leader of the developing country coalition in the way that it once was a leader, one of the leaders. It's much more of an ambivalent position. So perhaps not surprisingly, the idea of a person as a development economist or a subject of development economics is less tangible, less available. And then in that connection, of course, we have the issue of planning, which you mentioned, and you said planning hardly makes sense anymore. But one might say, well, just because there isn't a planning commission doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. Because, of course, there are many things which a country needs to do as a matter of rational economic policy, which requires some element of planning, small p, rather than capital P. For instance, just to give one little example, not so little example, big example, the energy transition in India. India's contribution to lowering carbon emissions, globally, so as to save the world, help to save the world from the calamitous outcome that otherwise is likely to result, requires at least small p planning. And it certainly requires capital P policies in order to do that, to ensure that renewable energy is being rolled out on a sufficient scale in the energy system, that it's being employed centrally to an increasingly central way, and so
on. Okay, so the panelists have let me know that if Jomo wants to make some comments, it's opened up to him. So
okay, yeah, and Jomo, you can do it in audio only mode. That's quite all right if you'd like. No pressure, but in case you have insight, which you always do.
And I see there are a few questions. I thought maybe I can at least, the ones which are addressable, maybe I can ask, because some of them are tough questions. Let me take the easiest one first. So someone asked that, could both the speakers and moderators comment on where you think economics education in India is headed to now? I mean, I have a much more practical view on this. which is, one of the things that I find very different from when I was studying and now teaching is that the increasing say that students have in determining or giving feedback about the system or determining what should be taught, which is a good thing, I think, because I came from a system where really you don't have a voice about anything. You just teach and give you exam. But also puts a certain kind of pressure if you have paying students and if students want certain kind of courses, it does pressurize departments, especially as universities are getting more competitive in getting students. Which is why a student perception about those disciplines which they feel will get them jobs, which is usually very data centric, programming centric, skills oriented centric, is becoming an important part of curriculum. And as a consequence, going forward, I see more and more some courses push to what is called electives, or those who want to do more, or else in certain departments which are seen as more I won't use the word heterodox because it's a very loaded word now, but maybe more broader thinking department. So I think one thing I see is more and more departments determined by the kinds of jobs you can get, and a lot of focus on getting internships and skill-based education. Another, I think, trend that I feel is shaping Indian economics now. I mean, a lot of economics in India originally was shaped by, sorry, let me rephrase. A lot of economics now is shaped by students wanting to go abroad. And so you want to do those kind of disciplines which help you join grad schools abroad. And public universities did not pander to that kind of need. It was really determined by the faculty's teaching. But more and more, you look at curricula abroad and you feel like your students need to know some of the foundations to be able to do that. And these are two trends I think is shaping curriculum, though I won't say it's positive or negative because I think change is good. And I think a good education should have different departments which offer, which are qualitatively different in what they believe a good economics should be. However, also a little bit concerned about, how much can, or how much, paying students shape economics curriculum. Sanjay, or even Jomo, if you have any thoughts, please, would love to hear.
I think you raise again a lot of important issues, Rahul. The question of what students need to learn to go abroad and to fit seamlessly into that system, and what do we mean by abroad? We typically mean the top institutions in the Anglosphere, right? Or those which are in turn looking to the Anglosphere. So that means in the case of economics, generally, with some exceptions, a particular kind of economics, of course. So the problem of interoperability, so to speak, that you want to have a curriculum which can prepare the student to do that, in turn generates its demands. We talked earlier about journal rankings and the way in which research is being rewarded or recognized or not, which is a global phenomenon of education ministries and so forth, fundings agencies, like the UGC in the case of India, changing their criteria in a way that would push every researcher and institution to do a different kind of work or a certain kind of work, and therefore in turn to teach in a certain way. But I think some of what's come out in the discussion is the complex ecology that's present in India: public, private, central universities, state universities, many different levels of prestige and resources, and so on. So, there's not going to be a single description in all of these cases. Student demands may be very important, which you described as, or you asked about, Rahul, in some of the new private universities, where the institutions are expressly trying to cater to students and to have a student-centered experience. They may not be so important in some of the traditional institutions. I think that that there's still, however, a lot of room for experimentation in some of the institutions, but in ways that may create different kinds of demands on faculty. Let me give one example. I teach a course. I have taught a course for a number of years for undergraduates, but I think it could be taught at any level, which is based on the Financial Times newspaper. So we read the Financial Times, we pick out a few articles to read in each class, and then we discuss them from an economic standpoint. And that might seem to you a trivial task, but actually it's not. It's extremely demanding on the economic knowledge of the people concerned. And to be very frank with you, I don't mean this to be arrogant, but I think that most faculty in economics are not capable of teaching such a course because they're not trained enough about the real world.
Yeah.
They don't know enough about the real world to be able to talk about what is happening in a timely and direct way. They have to consult some academic papers, or they confine themselves to a certain area of expertise. So the faculty member is also challenged by having to do that. Of course, it opens the student to a completely different way of thinking about what economics is. It's no longer about the textbook methods. That's not what the course is about. The course is about understanding the world, what is happening in the world in 2021, for example. And I think those kinds of shifts, which bring the spotlight more to onto the reality. It's just an example what I've given, right? There could be other ways of doing it. Place the spotlight on the reality and less on the methodology can help. One doesn't have to have put up a shingle saying one is doing heterodox economics or any other type of alternative or pluralist economics. Simply being governed by the need to understand the world using whatever methods and techniques seem appropriate will take one quite far, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but just add an anecdote here, just because I mentioned it, because I was thinking when I was an economics student, I'd have sleepless nights sort of learning up something like the Harrod-Toma model, because you had to sort of regurgitate it in the next exam. And I mean, actually, this is something I've also noticed, and something that would like. I mean, I'm bringing in my own teaching is that whatever you teach, as long as it's centered on the contemporary, or at least on the everyday, is something that pulls students in. So using data from India, looking at there's a lot of good field-based studies that are happening. For me, I think looking at important historical documents is even just looking at the budget or looking at plans is something that brings economics theories. I mean, it's something that gives students a way of accessing and understanding and thinking. And I think that is actually one great direction that economics teaching can move towards.
Absolutely. Understanding budgets is a very good example of that.
Yeah, I mean, I quickly add an anecdote. So recently, I'm teaching Indian economy, and I spoke to my students and I realized that they've never actually read an original economics document. So I decided to quickly put together a bunch, and I just picked up a Nehru speech, some writing by Gandhi, a budget document, a plan policy, and found to my great surprise that what are documents which are seen as very boring, students just sort of went at it with the kind of enthusiasm that I don't see in my other classes. So even it surprised me at how effective they are as pedagogical tools.
Rahul, if I may come in on a couple
of
things which Sanjay and you have been talking about. First, I think it's very interesting that when everybody talks about the theory of imperialism, they always talk about John Hobson and what he wrote about, over a century ago. But a contemporary of his, also in his Liberal Party, was actually Dadabhai Nauroji, who, as you all know, wrote on drainage. Now, almost nobody in the world, outside of a few Indian economists, actually recognize this. Another example would be the whole question of if we are trying to understand challenges of a post-colonial economy, surely what somebody like Alexander Hamilton had to say is far more relevant than what Adam Smith had to say. In terms of the colonial inheritance and all its implications. And both of them were writing, late 18th century. And although Hamilton's ideas were never really implemented until after the American Civil War, about 8 decades later, and would not have been implemented if not for the outcome of the Civil War. So you can see how the relevance of economic ideas is often contingent on social and political circumstances. And I think it's very important for us to recognize that for many post-colonial economies, it is crucial to be able to build appropriate institutions. Now, India is probably relatively more successful in the sense that you have people like Mahalanobis and others who were thinking about some of these issues at that time. But most developing countries have not had even that kind of advantage of people who are struggling with these kinds of challenges. If we can go to the other question, another question which has been raised, and that's the whole question of planning. Although it would be true to say that the modern firm is now having to deal with all kinds of challenges of flexibility, it is also be true to say that the modern firm, is really relies very, very heavily on planning. So it's wrong to say that planning is not relevant. The challenges of planning at the national level, of course, are very different from at the first level. But what does it mean for a conglomerate, for example? How do you plan and deal with the question of coordination in a conglomerate? And then if you scale it up further and you think about the challenges of a national economy, it's not as if planning is irrelevant. And think of the present situation which we are all living in now, dealing with the pandemic. How do you prioritize getting out of this pandemic? How do you ensure enough relief and the adequate and the appropriate distribution of relief? How do we ensure that the economy does not come to a grinding halt because of temporary recessions? And so so the whole role of the state in making those kinds of determinations is actually very, very relevant, even today. I mean, you don't have to assume you're dealing with the problems of socialist planning. No, the planning is very much, very, very essential. The other point, of course, is the relevance of the microeconomic assumptions we make about macroeconomic life. Okay, in the West, it's very common now in the last few decades to talk about the micro foundations for macroeconomics, and that's quite appropriate. But as an undergraduate, I still remember that I could not make sense of what I was learning. Basically Minnesota's so-called American Minnesota school kinds of assumptions about farmers producing and single commodities and so on and so forth. I found it much more relevant to read in those days. You had these air-flown editions of the Economic and Political Weekly, and the complexities of the farm and how farms were responding to different types of situations. So I think that kind of, it's not that we want to abandon microeconomics, but rethinking microeconomics which is relevant to our conditions. The conditions in India, of course, would be very different from, say, Argentina, where you have much more latifundias and so on and so forth. But I think we really do ourselves a disservice by not thinking much more carefully about one, history, as has been emphasized, and two, about comparative economic systems. Because even if we think of the variety of capitalisms, and probably nobody would disagree that capitalism is the main system in the world today, even arguably in China, the fact of the matter remains that there are a variety of capitalisms, and this is, everybody sort of knows this. If you look at, say, Lazonic's work comparing, say, American versus European versus Japanese, and so on and so forth. But when you extend that implications of that kind of thinking, you begin to realize, that how that variety and the recognition of variety is important. So this need for a comparative approach is actually terribly relevant. The last point I would make, and I've taken too much more time than I had actually intended to, is the whole point which Sanjay referred to, the project they are running in the new school. I mean, if you think about modern international monetary economics, and you think about how most developing countries deal with international monetary economics, both during the Bretton Woods period, in the post-Bretton Woods period, and how governments struggle to adjust to that, and then in the more recent period, where, in a sense, governments have lost control because they have, signed up to capital account liberalization and so on. So I think there is something to be said for a much more nuanced historical and comparative understanding of economics than is unfortunately the case in most of our curricula. Let me stop there. Thank you very much, Rahul.
Thank you for those lovely comments, Tomo. Sort of really added to this conversation.
Could I just say, I want to add only that I basically agree with everything that Jomo says, as usual, more or less. But he's my guru in these matters. But I think one could elaborate, of course, on certain points. I think the idea that we really need a global history, that's not a phrase he used, but I'll use it to try to capture some of what he said, a global history of how economics has addressed the questions and problems of the colonial world and the developing world. He gave the example of Alexander Hamilton, for instance, or not addressed them, had certain silences about them, has been shaped in relation to the imperatives, or on the basis of the imperatives of the colonizer, as we are discussing in this currency and empire group. I think that is a really rich and open agenda, where we have some important contributions that have been made. There's much that's already been said, but bringing all the threads together and telling that global history is something that's very important still to do for our current purposes, and it does directly feed into the curriculum question.
So I think before ending, I have a little bit of a mischievous question. I thought that we have a lot of students here, and maybe it's nice to have one maybe informal question, since we've been very academic till now, to sort of end. So this is for Sanjay and both Jomo. I think we'd love to hear from both of you. Since you have so many students, I would love to hear one maybe lesson or experience from your own intellectual journey or your graduation days which shaped what you did afterwards, or you sort of shaped your decision to be academics or someone who studied economics, or even shaped what specifically you focused on studying. Sorry to catch you off guard like this, but I couldn't let go of this opportunity.
I'm going to let Jomo go first while I think about that.
Well, you certainly have caught me off guard, but let me attempt an answer. I think a few things really have humbled me a lot in terms of learning. I think I've learned so much in the last year and a half when this country has been much more locked down than you all are in India. And so I've been, we have this culture of the Zoom culture, if I can put it that way, which has radically transformed interpersonal communications. I am able to listen to Sanjay's seminars in New York, to listen in the RAIN seminars and so on and so forth. I'm learning so much from so many different sources. And actually, I do a lot of the webinars in which I participate are often in Africa, and this is it's you learn a great deal, and you have to learn a great deal, because in a sense, how do you deal with a phenomenon which is changing our knowledge of it is changing, dealing with the pandemic, and now recognizing that the pandemic is endemic. What does it actually mean? And then in the last few days, learning that there might be a treatment, but we don't really know its efficacy, et cetera, et cetera. You know, so you know, struggling with to quote the late Donald Rumsfeld, not only the known unknowns, but also the unknown unknowns is really, really humbling. It's really humbling, I think. The other thing which has been very important for me, I was a UN bureaucrat for over about almost a dozen years, mainly in New York, but also for a short stint in Rome. And learning to, because we had a high premium on communicating with our readers. And our readers, most of them are not trained in economics. Many of them are struggling with English as a second language and so on and so forth. And so you really begin to, you know, to see the need to communicate effectively. And that, I think, is also something which is very, very, you know. So now, often when I'm asked to, when I write an article, or somebody comes to me and says, "Is this article going to make it?" I say, first ask your mother. Does your mother understand your article? And if your mother doesn't understand the language, you know, try somebody who understands the language, but you know, who has that kind of a background. And so now I've almost given up academic writing, to be very honest. I mainly write for the media, and I keep on pressing people like Sanjay to do more of that, because I think ultimately we reach far more people in that way. I also regret that there is, you know, that one has to look far and wide now to get, you know, 50 years ago or 45 years ago, I would have to, you know, I knew I could count on the Economic and Political Weekly to tell me something interesting about India. You know, those kinds of sources, the alternatives to the Economist, because in those days, the Economist was arrogantly imperialist. You know, now you know, now they are, you know, now they think they are cleverly imperialist. Okay, but in those days they were blatantly imperialist. You know, so you know, the world has changed, and we need to basically be able to help people cope with and understand the changing world. We can't change the world if we don't understand it, and that's I think the role of you know, people like ourselves, the so-called intelligentsia. Thank you.
Thank you, Jomo. Sanjay, you have the unenviable task of following that up.
Yes, indeed. I think Jomo has said so much that has to be, and so much that's quite valuable. I'm surprised, but not surprised, that Jomo agrees with Thomas Friedman now that the Earth is flat, in the sense that Zoom has enabled us to have conversations. Not what Thomas Friedman meant, but in a sense, the Earth has become flat because we can have conversations with Kenyans in the morning and I don't know what, Norwegians in the evening or what have you.
You remember I had a book called Flat World, Big Gap.
Yeah, right. Right. And that's a good point. That's actually a pretty clear summary of the current situation. Even if Zoom or equivalent and now allow a certain flatness, that doesn't change the gap. So, Rahul, with respect to your question, you know, I have a I don't want to delve too deeply into my psychobiography because I don't think that's going to be of interest to many people. But let me just say that that as someone who you know, by and large studied in various institutions of the West, one of the things that I was very attuned to was the silences about a number of issues. And I was troubled by those silences, or sometimes they weren't silences, they were even controversions, antagonistic positions that were taken up on a side which I didn't have full sympathy with, and which I didn't feel was in turn sympathetic to or even tried to understand its others. So I'll give an example. When I was undergraduate at one of these institutions, I walked into a class by David Landis, eminent economic historian, who has been a teacher of a number of people who have also taken views contrary to his. For instance, Prasannan Parthasarathy is a student of David Landis who speaks in the highest terms of David Landis. But I nevertheless found that Landis's attempt to describe why the West was rich and why the non-West was poor was profoundly culturalist, riven with cultural prejudices of various kinds. It was an expressly, unashamedly, unabashedly culturalist argument, of course. So that was not something he would necessarily have wanted to apologize for. But in his attempt to reject the views of the third worldist critics, so to speak, of imperialism and colonialism, he stereotyped them, oversimplified, and attacked a straw man, right? And so that by itself caused me to become much more interested in what those alternatives were. But of course, I also understood over time that there are more and less sophisticated versions of those. I think one of the difficulties we have in economics is the way in which the field is shaped by ideology, but it is not always recognized by those who it is shaped by. And there's a rhetoric of science, scientificity, which attaches to it. So if one is the sort of a person, I think one should try to be, who can see the sense or the logic or the content of different arguments that exist without dismissing them, on first glance, and then evaluate what are their merits and demerits in a careful manner. Then one is immediately in a minority, because many people are not doing that. They're taking up cudgels on behalf of some, one or another view, and so it becomes a little bit like being in a battlefield, right? And trying to be the careful observer on the battlefield, where there are few observers and there's no time to be careful, or no space to be careful. So I think that it's a inherently taxing and challenging thing to be to be in some sense scholarly in this domain. But I think that's part of what we're called upon to do, and the best scholars who have points of view are also scholarly. They don't just have points of view. So I just want to say that I think that we really need to cultivate the space for that. And one of the ways in which we have to do that is by allowing differences to exist of various kinds, and taking the different positions seriously, and not simply dismissing them out of hand.
So I think lots of thought-provoking things for students to take on board, and I think some lovely advice from Sanjay and Jomo. And I just wanted to sort of, I think maybe just wanted to end by saying that there were some really nice questions, but I think it didn't fit in so well with the flow. But thanks for asking the questions. And can I request a moderator, Samriddhi, if she wants to make any concluding remarks?
Yeah, of course. And thank you so much for such an engaging session. I mean, both the formal and informal way. And I'm sure we have learned so much. And for your very inspiring work in understanding the development of economics education, not just in India, but globally in your own ways that are very crucial. And at Rethinking Economics India Network, we actually hope to take the theme forward by expanding on the various anchors that you have put forth in the coming future that will add value to the network. And finally, with this, our 2021 annual event, Dialogues on Economic Realities, comes to an end. Thank you so much for staying and participating with us throughout the event. And we hope that you found the various themes and sessions insightful and enjoyed them as much as we all at the network did in curating for you. All our session recordings will be available on the YouTube channel, and we welcome any and every feedback to our events. And we look forward to continued engagement with you towards expanding pluralist, alternate, and new economics thinking in India. Thank you again and have a great week ahead. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And hopefully, Sanjay, will get to meet you sometime in the future when you come to India.
Absolutely. Look forward to that, Rahul and Samriddhi. Thank you so much to everyone. Jomo.
Thank you,
Nice to
Rahul
see
and Sanjay and the organizers.
See you. Bye.